We wanted to start, oh, sorry. Okay. We wanted to just start by thanking everyone for coming to this event today, and thanking Jim Dearden for being here and for being present at this Zoom. I wasn't sure if you were going to be here, Jim, and it's so good to see you. You and I have been exchanging letters for many years now. We've met once in person, so I'm so happy to be a part of this today, to be able to honor you as you surely deserve, and to see you here among us. It really means a lot. You are one of our most valuable Ruskin scholars. You have taught us all so much over the years, and you have such a generosity of spirit and of heart. You shared your knowledge with me when I was a very young Ruskin scholar just starting out, and I know I'm not the only person that you've done that with. Many, many people have benefited from your knowledge and your experience and your great kindness. And so I want to personally wish you a happy birthday. And thank you for letting us honor you. And I'll pass this over to Jim, and he can make some remarks as well.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Everybody in the UK, good afternoon. Good morning, good late morning, people here in the US. It is a wonderful thing to see all these names coming up on the screen and seeing the faces of so many of you. As we were saying a moment or two ago before we opened the meeting, it's such a delight to have all these Ruskin people coming together, even in this particular capacity, or perhaps only in this particular capacity. One thing that Sara did not say for the Ruskin Society of North America is why we have one. In fact, a couple of years ago, she and I were talking as people who are really seriously dedicated to Ruskin in America, that what the world needs now is another society dedicated to John Ruskin, his thought and his legacy. So we decided to create this group called the Ruskin Society of North America. We have our own board, which includes Gabriel Meyer out in Los Angeles, Anne Gagne in Toronto, and Kateri Ewing in East Aurora, New York, which is where the Roycroft organization is based. In any event, we have a lovely beginning group where COVID kind of kept us behind the scenes a bit because of all the restrictions associated with that. But we are up and running, and this is our first major international event, and it is occurring, as Sara said, thank you, Zoom, across 8 time zone, a full third of the globe, and we're delighted to have everybody here. Welcome to all. We're hopeful this is a great celebration of one of the great Ruskin people of all time. Jim Dearden, we will hear so much about him in the next hour or so, all well deserved. In any event, he is here at his home on the Isle of Wight, and we're going to start proceedings pretty much right away. I'm going to turn this back to Sara, who's going to introduce our first brief tribute to Jim from Rachel Dickinson.
We have a series of tributes for Jim today. Rachel will open these. Rachel was appointed Master of the Guild of St. George in 2019. She succeeded Clive Wilmer, who held the post since 2009. Rachel's the first female Master of the Guild. She's also a Principal Lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University. An accomplished craftsperson herself, her most recent publications are on Ruskin and textiles, and she has lectured worldwide on Ruskin, sustainability, and craft. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, Sara, and thank you, everyone. I'm just trying to remove that note. Right, there we go. So, as Sara has said, I am now the current Master of the Guild of St. George. But as many of you know, from 2005 to 2009, Jim Dearden held that post and served as the 13th Master of the Guild of St. George. So I'm beginning by simply formally and with great thanks, acknowledging the debt that we owe to Jim as a guild and as a network, global network of Ruskinians. He was very much a key figure in helping to position the guild to what it is now in that key period as we went from 2000 to 2019, and Jim serving as a master in that period and then succeeded by Clive really helped to shape what the guild has become. But as I began thinking about today and what to say, I began to realize the degree to which actually Jim has not just been a shaping force in the life of the guild, but actually a shaping force in my life. I think more than I'd ever realized before I began to think about today. So I'm going to turn very personal for a couple of minutes and just talk about how Jim has sort of given rise to the person that I am now. When I moved from Canada to the UK, it was to go to Lancaster, and Ruskin was not meant to be the main figure that I worked on, but I was going to, at least in part, work with the collection that Jim had been the caretaker of for so many years before it moved to Lancaster. I began to read some of the letters, and we were chatting a bit about letters before the formal section today began, and I began to read letters to Joan Severn and really started to fall in love with those. And there was that conference at Lancaster University in 2000, and one of the sort of headline events at it was near the end, we had Van Akenburd and Jim Dearden sitting down and sharing their wisdom and their thoughts about Ruskin to those of us who were there. And I remember Jim saying, actually, much as Jim Spates has just been saying about some letters at the Huntington, I remember Jim saying that there were these letters to Joan Severn in the collection, and that was really the next big thing that he would love to see worked on. And I thought, those are my letters. I want to work on those. And so in many ways, Jim actually then was the reason why I ditched the PhD topic I was working on and started a new topic a year into my project. When I joined the Guild of St. George, again, Jim was there as a figure on the board who I knew, very much respected, admired. And so I was utterly delighted when, as he was beginning to think of stepping down, I was asked if I would be willing to step in and take on what had been his role of being the director for Ruskin Affairs. Now, I could never fill in the depth of knowledge and breadth of knowledge that Jim brought to that post, but it was a great joy to try to step into those shoes of somebody who I'd so admired. And so again, that shaping force of Jim in sort of my taking on what had been his role within the board. The generosity of Jim is something that Sara's already mentioned. And again, over the years, so many times, a letter has appeared in the post with a bit of information that I needed, or a conversation, and suddenly he is sharing wonderful knowledge without ever that sense that sometimes has of sort of holding on to and protecting areas. Jim's always been very giving and sharing and helpful with his knowledge of Ruskin. And I think that's part of the strength of character and what we're all sort of acknowledging here today. In fact, even when I was doing the exhibition at Manchester, when I desperately needed some elements of Ruskin ephemera, Ruskiniana, it was Jim who stepped up to send what were actually the opening pieces that most people were actually spending ages just staring at and immersing themselves in terms of the cultural elements of that. So as this award shows, and as my little personal anecdotes show, Jim is somebody who has helped so many people over the years and helped shape so many careers and trajectories over the years. And really, as sort of the keeper of the flame, and I'll borrow that term from a Ruskin title, as keeper of the flame, he has really been instrumental in helping appreciation of Ruskin to grow again from the obscurity it had been at one point in the last century to really almost becoming a household name again. And for that, we all owe him a great, great debt. And so thank you, Jim, from me very personally, but also very much from the Guild of St. George and its companions. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, Sara. It is a great delight to have you with us. And as always, your eloquent comments, and Jim, so well deserving of all the things that you just said in acknowledgement of his importance to us all. It is my happy task now to turn to Paul Dawson, who will be our next speaker. Another brief tribute to Jim. Paul is a friend of mine of long standing. We have known each other probably for at least a quarter century, largely in the context of the Friends of Ruskin's Brantwood. He is still the director of the Friends of Ruskin's Brantwood, as he is the editor of the Friends of Ruskin's Brantwood newsletter, which comes out twice a year. He is a major person in Ruskin Studies, as you all know. And he is, I don't want to miss a chance to notify you all of this. He has, through a very wonderful moment of happenstance, quite a few years ago, come across a whole series of letters between Ruskin and George Allen, his publisher, which had never been published. Paul has been working very hard now on a biography of George Allen. It is now basically complete in serious draft and getting ready to go out to publishers. We will all look forward to that, and we will all want it on our shelves when it comes about. In any event, Paul Dawson has known Jim in this capacity of the George Allen letters, not to mention other capacities, for a long time. And I want to say welcome to Paul as a friend, as a fellow Ruskinian, and as somebody who knows Jim Dearden well. Paul, it's your chance to give us out now some thoughts about your time with Jim Dearden.
Thank you, Jim. I first found Ruskin in 1969. Coincidentally, the same year that Jim Dearden's International Ruskin Studies Conference was held at Brantwood. That was an event that, as we all know, proved to be a pivotal point in revitalizing an interest in Ruskin that would go on to attract a new generation of Ruskin scholars. Sadly, I was not there in 1969. I was at the time an art student in Hampshire who kept on finding references or quotations related to someone called John Ruskin. I wanted to know who this person was, and so many authors wanted to cite his works or refer to opinions. And of course, this is long before the internet or online research or the online searching for books. But there were bookshops, and plenty of them. I spent a lot of time searching many dusty shelves. And I seem to recall the dustiest ones are the ones that had Ruskin in, because not many people were looking at them. I found Collingwood's and Cook's biographies and another half dozen by those who had or had not known Ruskin by varying degrees. Meanwhile, friends and family who knew of my interests from time to time sent me newspaper cuttings and magazine articles. And it's among these that I first came across the name James S. Dearden. And here, I found a clear, concise style of communication that made Ruskin's writings and the story of his life so accessible and fascinating to me as someone new to Ruskin. And that, as I would see in later years at first hand, continues to be very important as further generations of young students access his writing. The Shire Lifeline series book on Ruskin has been reprinted and revised several times since it first appeared back in 1973. Almost 50 years after its issue, it's on the reading list for students in America. I wonder how many new readers of Ruskin has helped in that time, just as the more recent but equally successful book on Brantwood that both visitors and Ruskin readers love to take home. And Ruskin's Camberwell, recently revised and reprinted, not only accessible, but so easily affordable to students and visitors to London or to Brantwood, but compelling information. And of course, there are the large scholarly studies, the bibliographical listing of Ruskin's own library, and A Life in Pictures, the invaluable catalogue that records more than 300 portraits of Ruskin. In the 1990s, I went to the Isle of Wight to visit the Ruskin galleries at Benbridge. This was several years before the contents were transferred to Lancaster. And I don't expect for one moment to expect that Jim had any reason to remember this, but it was then that I met him for the first time and purchased a copy of his Ruskin, Benbridge and Brantwood book. When I got home, I read it from cover to cover in a matter of days. Then straight away went back to the beginning to read it all over again slowly. Of course, these are but a few of Jim's publications that all of us here know so very well. It's a little while after that that Jim spoke to the Friends of Brantwood in the drawing room at Brantwood. It was an evening meeting towards dusk, and the house lights were on. About 30 or so had gathered, and Jim gave a talk simply titled This Room. It is, in my memory, one of the best and most fascinating talks I've ever attended. In the evocative low light and with a slide projector at hand, Jim spoke of the events that occurred in that very room and in various parts of the house during the Ruskin years. His talk, like his books, a gentle-paced and sensitive developed story of events and people, full of facts and detail. I look back on that experience as being the point in time when I decided that should I ever write or even speak, all of which was barely a consideration at this time, this way, Jim's way, is what I would want to achieve. That gift to communicate in both spoken and written form is a wonderful gift indeed. Now, as you can see, I can't claim to have managed that yet, and I certainly wouldn't want Jim to be blamed for my shortcomings. But I would like to say this. Whenever I read through what I've prepared, I ask, will this adequately meet my audience needs or interests? And is there a word more, or often importantly, a word less, that could make it better? And many times as I prepare to stand up in front of an audience, whether it be students or seasoned scholars, I record sitting in that darkening room and listening to Jim, and have determined to do my best to make the next hour of their lives something that will be remembered, even if I will not. So Jim, without your writings, I would never have had the opportunities that have come my way to write, to speak, and to travel. You set the standard we all try to attain. Your research is meticulous. Your books are a delight to read and a constant and reliable source of reference. And your generosity and willingness to share your vast knowledge is known to all of us gathered here. I would say that if the Guinness Book of Records ever carries out research to find the most acknowledged and most thanked name to be found in the introduction of books of all time, I place a handsome sum on that name being James S. Dearden. Where would we in Ruskin Studies be without you? We all owe you so much. I'm honoured to be among this company today. And thank you, Jim, for inspiring more than 50 years of fascination with the life and work of John Ruskin. Happy birthday.
Thank you, Paul. Very well said, delightfully delivered to us all. And I wish I had been in that room with you so many years ago. I can see what an impression it made on you. We now turn to our subject himself. When we were getting together thinking about the Ruskin Society of North America, it occurred to all of us that we should have something significant that we do every year, or as nearly close to every year as we could arrange, that would honor some Ruskin work. And it occurred to us that there was nothing anywhere, as far as we knew, called the Ruskin Lifetime Achievement Award. So we decided to invent something called the Ruskin Lifetime Achievement Award. And we had a round robin of chats about various people who we thought might be eminent recipients of it. There were quite a few. Many of them are here with us today, and including Jim, of course. And finally, we all settled and unanimously and enthusiastically on James S. Dearden. We said, now, is there anybody out there who is more important to what's going on in Ruskin these days in the world than Jim Dearden? And the answer was no. And so we were very glad to select him for this. But we then also knew from our experience, and many of you have had the similar experience, that Jim and the internet are not bosom friends. So we thought we would like to have Jim speak at this event, and we realized that that was going to be impossible, partly because of technology, partly because Jim and the internet are not bosom friends, and partly because of COVID, we couldn't get to him very easily. So that brought up, in my mind, it brought up Howard Howe, who is a dear friend to many of us who are here today. And I thought of Howard as the curator of Brentwood, and I thought that maybe Howard might be willing to get in a car and get himself down to the Isle of Wight to talk to Jim about his life in and with Ruskin. So I called up Howard, and he very graciously agreed to get down there and to do an interview with Jim. And so here's Howard for a minute or two to introduce our interview video of Jim Dearden on the day of this event of his Lifetime Achievement Award. Howard?
Thank you, Jim, and Thank you, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here. Well, you can imagine that when Jim phoned me and asked me if I'd be willing to do this, that I was honoured and thoroughly delighted with the idea. And I've never been a television interviewer, so I wasn't quite sure how I was going to pull it off. But the biggest challenge was that we were in the middle of our lockdown at the time. And I wasn't sure it was actually legal for me to go to the Isle of Wight. But anyway, I got in a car and I drove all the way. For those of you who haven't been to the smaller of Britain's many isles, the Isle of Wight is tucked into the south coast of England. And for the best part of 65 years or more, the Ruskin Collection, White House Collection, was housed in a school there, the Benbridge School. And so Jim has been the person who has looked after that collection, has understood it, has mined it in the most remarkable and wonderful way. And I often think of Jim really as the sort of Sherlock Holmes of the Ruskin world. His detective abilities are unparalleled, and the sense of drama that unfolds in terms of the search and the investigation of things is always wonderful when one reads his account of them. For me personally, arriving at Brantwood 25 years ago now, and taking on responsibility for the collection here, what better person could I possibly have had than Jim to introduce me to the extraordinary stories behind every object that there is at Brantwood. And Jim has really made my job what it is. He's allowed me to see into the place, into the house, into the world of Brantwood, into the objects there, and to understand the life of them, both in Ruskin's time and importantly, what happened to them afterwards as well, because it's a wonderful continuing story, which Jim has done a great deal to expose, and is an important history. So I got down to the Isle of Wight and found Jim in very good fettle. The most important business of the day was fixing somewhere to eat. The crab and lobster, I think for both of us, it was our first meal out for probably about a year. Anyway, we got down to the business. It's recorded on an iPhone, and I have no idea what it's like now, but the masters of technology over in America have had a chance to work on it. So I look forward to it. But thank you, Jim, for letting me come and talk to you. It was a huge privilege and a great milestone in my life. And you've always been there as a wonderful support and spirit. Thank you.
Sara, do you want to introduce the video?
I think Howard has done an excellent job doing that. I think we can just go straight into it.
Well, Jim, it's a pleasure to be with you. Finally, to get to Benbridge.
Good to see you here.
I can't believe that my own journey in Ruskin for so much of my life, and I've not been to Benbridge before. It seems I know it really well in some ways, but then again, to actually be physically here is just a treat.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
And it's lovely to catch up with you again, and to have an opportunity for our friends around the world, I should say,
Yeah.
to meet you at home and to learn a little bit about your life in Ruskin, really. It's probably such an enormous subject that we're hardly going to touch the surface of it in such a
yes,
short amount of
several
time.
days will be needed.
It would really. I've always been very aware of that. But one of the great things that you've done as you've gone along this journey, Jim, is to annotate it in some wonderful memoirs and books, not books just of great scholarship value, but also ones which have sort of shown your personal journey in lots of ways when you've made discoveries. And I've always found that a very exciting and inspiring part of the way that you've approached writing about Ruskin, and is the sense of discovery and exploration, which I think is something that's now shared around the Ruskin world.
Well, that's what I like to do. I've got several little exploratory ventures going on at the moment, at least I will be when I can see properly again.
Right.
All at once things fall into place,
Yes.
you know?
Yes.
And all you've got to do is somehow prove what you hope is right.
Right. Yeah. Well, I get the feeling that that this is a journey that you're certainly not done with yet. You've got. I'm going to reserve to later talking about some of your sort of current fascinations and so forth. I'd like to go back and start really right at the beginning, because I think I don't know whether any of us really know how you first came to Ruskin. Are you a Benbridge boy? I mean, were you born here?
No. I was born in Barrow-in-Furness.
Ah.
But I came to school at Benbridge.
Mm.
My parents decided it would be a good idea to send me away to school, so they thought they'd make a decent job of it, 300 odd miles.
And on another island as well.
Yeah. Yes. But how did I get involved with Ruskin? Well, I've always been a book collector, not reader necessarily.
Yes.
And I started collecting Lake District books, anything about the Lake District, by people in the Lake District, printed in the Lake District, whatever. And so this way, by the time I was, I suppose, about 10 or 11, I had Collingwood's biography of Ruskin, and I had a Ruskin pamphlet, Udale and its Streamlets. Didn't read them, but they fitted my collecting pattern,
yes.
You know. And this went on for years and has continued ever since. But I really wasn't interested in Ruskin at all. Yes, I suppose I was a little more interested in my contemporaries at school, because of course Whitehouse, who founded Benbridge School as a boarding school for boys, was one of the 3 or 4 dedicated Ruskin collectors in the first third of the last century. And he put together, a few years ago, the largest collection of Ruskin material in the world, including, of course, Brantwood, Ruskin's home at Coniston. Having finished at school here and done my national service, I went into a small publishing firm. I was in Gloucestershire for 3 years, and then in London for 2 years, until I couldn't stand London or the people I was working with any longer. And I gave up and went back home. Whitehouse by this time had been dead for 2 years, and his successor in looking after the school, if you like, was a chap called Geron Lloyd. And Mr. and Mrs. Lloyd were staying at Brantwood over Easter. They phoned and said, will you and your parents come up and have coffee with us or something, you know? And so we went, and Lloyd was a very, very astute barrister, very astute. I mean, if you wanted to win, you've got Lloyd. And during the course of the conversation, Benbridge came up, and he said, of course, we've got all of these Whitehouse papers there, you know, because he had an interesting political life before he founded the school. And he said they're far too important just to throw away. They need sorting and filing and dealing with. Do you know anyone that can do it? I said, yes, I could, you know, simple as that. So within a week, I was back at Benbridge. And that was in 1957.
Well, that's an extraordinary beginning there, Jim, because it's amazing that you happen to be in the 2 key places,
yes.
The Lake District and the Isle of Wight, sort of at an absolutely pivotal moment in Ruskin's presence, as it were.
Yes, yes.
I mean, many people will not really know what Benbridge was. Benbridge was a private school.
It was a private school, not a sort of way out modern one, but slightly more modern in lines than the older, more established public schools.
And were you aware when you were a pupil there of Whitehouse's deep interest in Ruskin?
Yes.
I mean, did it permeate the school?
I mean, he built 2 galleries, well, a library and a gallery. And every now and again, groups of us were invited into the gallery, and Whitehouse would talk about some of the pictures that were hanging. Ruskin came up fairly frequently in Whitehouse's chapel addresses on a Sunday. So yes, one was aware of Ruskin. One wasn't particularly interested in him.
No.
One was aware of his presence at Benbridge. You know?
Right. And at that point, was the collection just really? I mean, he built these galleries when you were a pupil there. But was the collection out to sea, or was most of it sort of in boxes?
It was.
How was it? What sort of state was it all in?
He was a true collector.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the letters and manuscripts were still wrapped in the wrapping paper they'd come from Sotheby's in.
Right.
I mean, his agent had bought them for him. He hadn't even opened them. He was a collector.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
Which is one of the problems, because I suppose modern Ruskin scholarship, apart from Helen Fillion, who was working from the 1920s, modern Ruskin scholarship began in the 1950s. And periodically, Whitehouse was quite old by this time and not very well. People would write and say, do you have so-and-so, or can you help with this, that and the other? And the Burst would reply saying, Warden isn't well enough to deal with this inquiry. So it was his own personal, private collection, basically. But people came in to look at the pictures,
yes,
not the manuscripts. But by the time I'd got to Benbridge, modern Ruskin scholarship was just taking off. People like Helen Fillion and Van Bird and Sam Brown and one or two others were beginning to get interested in doing work, and were writing to ask about things in the collection.
Was there a sense that North America was playing a stronger part in it almost than Britain at that time? I mean, you've just mentioned two of the great American Ruskin scholars there.
Yes, there wasn't much English interest at this time. It was American interest, basically, yes. And in fact, because I was living and working in the galleries, these inquiries that came into the Bursa about things in the collection were just sent down to me. So essentially I had to learn my Ruskin and catalogue the collection in order to be able to deal with these inquiries.
Yes,
which of course took several years. You know?
That's a familiar experience. I can sympathise with that. Certainly, I learned an awful lot by the questions that not just our visitors, but also people writing in to find out more about. Have you got this? Do you know when this was?
Yes,
so
yes,
yeah.
The first Ruskin people that came, I'm not sure whether it was Van Bird or Helen Fillion. I really can't remember which it was, but they were among the first. And when Van came, he brought his wife and his daughter, and the Bursa had recently bought a little cottage for himself, which was next door but two to my house. And he'd done it up, and it was doing it for letting. And I told Van about this, and he said, well, fine, let's stay there, you know. And Van said, in preparation for his coming, would I order him 6 quarts of milk?
Oh.
Or was it pints? Anyway, when he arrived, the milk bottles ran from the door down to the gate, you know. And he didn't know that there was a difference between the English measurement and the American one. You know? So I think they lived on milk for heaven knows how long. Anyway, this was when Van was working on the Winnington letters, which was duly published. And I think probably just before Helen Fillion had come, another contemporary collector of Whitehouses was a chap called Fred Sharp, who was a very self-effacing chap and a brilliant wood turner. And he had built another important Ruskin collection, nowhere near as big as White House or Pierpont Morgan or whatever, but with a huge amount of important stuff in it. And White House used to come and have breakfast with us, and then go up to Coniston, and then come back and have dinner, and then we put him on the sleeper train and send him back to Benbridge occasionally. And we said to him, next time you come up, we'll take you to meet Fred Sharp. Oh yes, he said. He clearly wasn't interested. You know. Anyway, he duly came and we took him to meet Fred Sharp. And you could see his eyes getting bigger and bigger and bigger as Sharp produced other things, manuscripts for him to see. And when he produced the Brantwood diary, White House was nearly apoplectic. He said, "Do you see, that belongs to me. I bought the diaries. I bought the diaries." And Sharp said, "But not this one." You know? And it was interesting to see them together. Anyway, Sharp had been collaborating with Helen Fillion, who was doing a lot of basic research on Ruskin's background, family background, and he was making manuscripts available to her, or transcribing things for her book that Ruskin's Scottish Heritage, I think it's called. It stopped short a generation before Ruskin is born. Sharp, round about this time, died suddenly. He had already written his will and left his collection to Mrs. Holmes, who was his landlady. But as he lay on the hearthrug in front of his fire, dying, he said, "I'd like Mrs. Fillion to have my manuscripts." So Helen Fillion eventually came over to collect these manuscripts and other odds and ends that Mrs. Holmes gave her. And after she'd been to Barrow, she came down to Benbridge because there were obviously many, many, many things in the White House collection that she wanted to examine. And she was with me for about 10 days, I suppose. And she worked. She got up about 8 o'clock in the morning. She went over to the refectory and had breakfast with the school, lunch with the school, staff dinner, and she went to bed about midnight, taking manuscripts with her to transcribe. She found a cork bath mat in the bathroom, and that made a marvellous desk in bed, you know? Incredible. But she did a huge amount of work and left a lot of notes about things in the collection, sort of folded with manuscripts, explaining things. She came, and then Van came. Sam Brown corresponded but didn't come. And those are the earliest visitors that I had, the earliest Ruskin visitors. So,
and in terms of the collection, then you were working on it and beginning to try and in a way put it into more shape. What at that time appeared to be the objective? Was it set by White House? Did he have a vision for it? Was it
no?
It was Geraint Lloyd.
He was a collector.
Yes.
I imagine that he fondly imagined that, having built the galleries, that was its permanent home, and the school would look after it. The school took a different view. That the school didn't see that it got any benefit from the collection. The fact that it made Benbridge known across the world didn't seem to interest them, you know. However, there we are. But I imagine that White House foresaw the galleries as its permanent home, maintained by the school.
Yes. Yeah.
And Geraint had to fight for this as well, with increasing opposition from some of his co-directors, and bursars who were able to say, well, of course, if we let this building for so-and-so, we'd save £100,000 a year, you know. versus our past masters at showing how to save money impractically for this collection, to deal with all of this. Can't afford one of those, he said. Well, I just happened to know that Tom Stedman, who was the senior master and taught many subjects, including printing, because you say we had our own private press, I knew he wanted to give up printing because it was quite time consuming. So I said to Lloyd, look, you take me on as curator and I'll take over printing from Tom. That's a different matter, he said. Done.
Excellent.
Simple as that. Well, I've been a book collector all my life up to that stage. I've been with a publishing firm. I've been at Benbridge as a boy, but I'd never actually handled type. Tom had me working with him for about a term before he finally gave up. And during that time, we printed a little pamphlet called Printing at Coniston.
Yeah.
And so I then juggled the galleries with printing.
I'll be pleased to know there are still many of your works at Brantwood in the collection. These are the little pamphlets you're referring to, some of the printing pieces that were done at Benbridge came up to Brantwood when the collection was moved.
Yes,
moved up. But it was it certainly rounded your experience off in a nice way, because I know that when one of the joys of your masterpiece on Ruskin's library is the essay that you preface it with on the ex libris labels, which I think is something that could not have been done by anybody other than somebody who understood the process of printing in wonderful detail.
Yes, it suddenly, when I was cataloguing the books at Benbridge, I became aware of the book plates, and I realised that there were two different sorts, very different typefaces. So that really was what began it. And whenever one came across a book belonging to Ruskin, one looked at the typeface that was used for printing it. And some interesting things happened. For instance, there's one book plate printed in a typeface that wasn't designed until I think 1926, which is, you know,
A bit of a giveaway, really.
Yeah, that giveaway, yeah. But printing has given me a lot of pleasure. It's a purely mechanical art. I can't draw to save my life, but I can lay out a page and then get there by purely mechanical means. And it gives me a lot of pleasure as well. We printed the school newspaper every term, up to 48 pages a term. And this was a very time-consuming job. It took me certainly the best part of 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, for the last 4 weeks of every term. And into that I had to integrate gallery visitors or other things relating to the gallery. So the last 4 weeks of every term were very, very busy. And then at Christmas, some member of staff would come along and say, oh, you'll print me some Christmas cards again, won't you? You know. So I hate Christmas.
I think you're in good company. Ruskin wasn't exactly a fan of
well, he was a Scot. They did New Year, not
that's
Christmas.
Right, absolutely. So the collection and Ruskin scholarship starts in the 1950s. It's starting to
take off.
Yeah.
And
awareness of what is at Benbridge is an important part of that, and is obviously beginning to come out. What are your first publications in Ruskin? What did you first?
The first, there's a little journal, I imagine it still runs, called Cumbria.
Yes, it does.
And I wrote an article on Brantwood and sent it to the editor of Cumbria, and was absolutely amazed. This was the first thing I'd ever written. Absolutely amazed when he wrote back and said, yeah, of course I'll print it. And even more amazed when he sent me a check. So
they don't do that today.
Things took off. You know. But my first book Well, I did this pamphlet printing at Coniston and other odds and then little things like that. But my first book was Arthur Seven's memoir of Ruskin. I'd come across correspondence between Seven and Whitehouse, with Whitehouse urging Seven to finish his book. And I had no idea what this book was, but eventually it emerged that it was his memoirs of Ruskin. And I found that this was in Manchester Public Library, I think. And I got a microfilm of it and projected onto the wall of my lounge, which was white, and sat with a typewriter on my knee transcribing it. And it's very interesting, at least I think it's interesting, the sidelights that Arthur Seven shows about Ruskin, just incidents in Ruskin's life they thought were sort of memorable. And I put it together as a little book called The Professor and sent it to Stanley Unwin. And to my amazement, he said, well, of course, it won't make a fortune, but we'll publish it. And I had a contract which was laughingly called a profit sharing contract, which meant that I didn't get anything, but he did, you know. Anyway, it was eventually remaindered, and Brantford bought the remainder. Probably still have a lot kicking around.
Well, we still do have a few, but they sell. They go out on the second-hand bookshelves as well, and we do. No, it's a useful little book, and of course Brantwood is enriched always by this business of the coming together of bits of a jigsaw that bring it back to life in some way.
Yes.
Because it was a home, because it's where Ruskin was, all the objects play a part somehow in bringing a picture back to life.
Yes.
And I think you've done, well, I know you've done more than anybody, obviously, to bring that picture back to life in terms of understanding the way that the objects that fit into the jigsaw.
You just get interested in crazy little details.
Yes.
I'm essentially a details man.
Yes.
And they're fascinating. They really are.
We might take the camera into your study.
Yes.
And just have you can just have a look at your books. You can maybe tell us a bit about one or two.
Sure.
But before we wrap up here, one of the things I suppose I should ask you is, if you look at all the work you've done on Ruskin, and it's probably an impossible question for you to answer, but I'll ask it anyway. What do you think you're proudest of in terms of your Ruskin?
I think probably the library catalogue. One or two people, quite independently of each other, have said, well, that's equals importance with the library edition. So I think that probably is the one.
I admire it hugely. I mean, I find myself using it increasingly, and every time it's absolutely a bedrock.
There's a huge amount of work in it. It all started, of course, with a catalogue of the Ruskin stuff at Benbridge, which I printed. And then once the bigger project started, I cut up a copy and pasted up on index cards. And thereafter, a collection of index cards grew. Same, I'd done a catalogue for Brantford as well. I used that. And I ended up with about 10 or a dozen boxes of index cards. And new stuff was turning up less and less regularly. And so I thought, it's time I did something with them, you know? And I thought, I mean, I'd been writing these cards over 10 years or more, and there was no particular system to them. They weren't all absolutely identical. I thought, what a job, I can't face doing that. And quite out of the blue, I had a letter from an old, amazingly generous friend saying, I've just sold this field up in Northumberland, and really, I don't need the £5,000 that I've got for it. Have you got a use for £5,000? And I wrote back and said, thank you very much. I do have a use for £5,000. So I found a secretary in Cowes who typed the whole lot and put it into the same sequence for £5,000.
Fantastic.
Sheer luck.
Wonderful.
Right place at the right time.
Yeah, absolutely. Marvelous.
And then I touted it round publishers, and they all burst out laughing and said, who'd want that? Who'd want that? You know? And I realised eventually that the one thing that I hadn't catalogued was the Cook and Wedderburn collection. Wedderburn had a collection of Ruskin, Cook had a collection of Ruskin, and together they made the Cook and Wedderburn collection of Ruskin when they were doing the library edition.
Right.
And the Cook and Wedderburn collection is in the Ashmolean, and it's in the room belonging to a friend whose name escapes me. And I said, well, why do you have it? He said, I was there now with spare shelves. Anyway, I went in and I checked the Cook and Wedderburn collection just to see if any of the books had actually originally come from Brantwood. And one or two of them had. So they went into the listing. And I was telling him the sad story about people who burst out laughing. He said, well, that's no problem, he said, because the Oxford Bibliographical Society exists to do exactly this, publish library catalogues. So he put me in touch with the editor, and the rest, as they say, is history, you know?
It's beautifully produced.
It is, isn't it?
It's a lovely bit of...
I think it costs £60 or something a copy.
Yeah, but academic books are all of that sort of
I had
ilk or
I
worth.
after it was, I went to the launch in the old library at Corpus, Christchurch, and when I got back a few days later, I had a letter from someone involved in the society saying, we're sending you the 72 copies that you said you'd like. I thought, I never mentioned 72 copies. So I wrote and said, look, I never mentioned 72 copies. I could do with a dozen. I said, but I couldn't afford 72 copies, and I'd have nowhere to put 72 copies. Don't worry, they said, we weren't charging you for them. So they sent me a dozen, which I managed to dispose of, and still have one or two left. You know?
And then finally, is there one thing out there, one Ruskin mystery, as it were, one missing document or one fact or subject that you would still really dearly love to find out?
There is, actually. It's probably not what you're thinking of. What you're thinking of, there are probably so many of them that one hasn't thought of them yet. But there's one that I'm in the process of cracking, because it will be in my next article in the Friends newsletter. And it, should we say, it involves White House and Arthur Seven and something that you have on exhibition at Brantwood.
Right.
And I think I've cracked it. You know?
Oh wow! Well,
I didn't realise that it was waiting to be cracked. You know, until I thought, yes, that's it. You know? All I'm going to do now is prove it.
Very good. Well,
all I'm going to do is prove it.
We shall have to come back and find out what the sequel is.
Well, the last article that I did, that Paul tells me is the last one he has in stock, where we proved that the coronation suit in the Keswick Museum was from the coronation, not from the presentation of court, by the note on the inside of a pocket, which I had missed when I went there. Ruskin was at Oxford when the suit was made for him. His father had been into the London tailor and said, make me a suit. The tailor didn't know what the son's name was and wrote John James Ruskin Jr. So that shows that it was made by this London tailor who didn't know Ruskin.
Knew his father.
So, and I said to Paul, this is the last, I can't think of anything else to do. And having sent the letter, I suddenly thought of something else, which is the basic subject of the next article, which will take a little while to filter through. So you've got to wait with bated breath.
Absolutely. Well, we end there on a cliffhanger. Let's go have a look at
Right.
at the study, shall we? This is just a mixture of reference stuff.
Mainly pre-Raphaelites, Turner, Whistler, and the pre-Raphaelites, Burne-Jones. William Morris is in the lounge. And then Ruskin begins there and goes on endlessly. And the floor is almost as cluttered as it was when I had bought the last lot of shelves now. Most of the ones down there, yes, certainly from there up to there, are all ones that belong to Ruskin with his annotations in them. And this, I did an article on this. Peter Miller had it, and he didn't know what to make of it, and he asked me what I thought of it, and I couldn't make anything of it either. But eventually, I cracked it. I probably picked the wrong volume. All of the illustrations have been cut out and carefully put back.
Or marked up in some way.
You see, and this is, I worked out a question of the right hand not knowing what the left hand was doing. And George Allen was in the process of doing this green edition, or blue edition in that binding, the Works series, and he was going to include the Stones of Venice. But the illustrations, instead of being throughout the text, were going to be grouped together in one place. And Ruskin was in Venice and wrote to George Allen and said, "I'm writing a new Stones of Venice called St. Mark's Rest. It'll make the Stones of Venice redundant." And George Allen, I don't know how much of the type he had set, but he'd certainly advertised it. So that's a ghost.
Right.
A ghost, bibliographically, is something that has been advertised but never ever printed.
Yeah.
But once it's advertised, you can never get rid of it.
Okay. Well, that was, I'm sure you all enjoyed that as much as I did. There is more of it too. We had to shorten it up a bit for our presentation. And I want to let you know before I say any more that what you saw today and some of the other bits that were not shown will be made available at the Ruskin Art Club YouTube page and also at the Ruskin Study for North America webpage. So you can go back and watch that again or watch the parts that we were not able to include just in the interest of time today. I want to thank Howard again for making that journey to the Isle of Wight and Jim for such a really wonderful interview. There's so much in it that it just, I sit here and marvel at the people that Jim has known, the experiences that he's had. I just was laughing. I love the line, William Morris is in the lounge. I thought that was great. But there's so much that Jim has given us through his experience of all these people who were grounded in Ruskin, who studied Ruskin, and his own first hands-on experience of the collection. Jim knows that collection so well and has been able to enrich our understanding of it because of his knowledge of it. I think this is a wonderful window on the development of a scholar, of a Ruskin scholar. We can see in what Jim has told us, the stories that he shared with Howard and with the rest of us, in this lifetime of research and writing and publication. And it's all driven by this curiosity and also by this love of detail. And Jim said that himself, he's a details man. But those details have made Ruskin and his work and his life come so alive for all of us. All of these things that others might consider small details have enriched our understanding of Ruskin to such a great degree. I mean, Jim's books are such a treasure for me, and I'm sure for all of you. And I've learned about aspects of Ruskin's life that I never would have known by reading other Ruskin research. So the details enrich our understanding and bring that to life. And Jim was talking about the library catalog as being, the book he's most proud of. And I would agree with him that it's as important as the library edition. I use the library catalog a lot in my own research. And it's so wonderful to be able to open that book and find out, was Ruskin reading this particular book that I'm interested in knowing if he knew. I was doing some work recently on Ruskin and the Americans, Emerson, Thoreau, Muir, wondering if Ruskin had owned any books by these people. I knew about Emerson, he knew Emerson, but Muir, Thoreau, did he have any of these books? Did he read them? Who did I turn to? I turned to Jim. I turned to his book, pulled it right out and was able to do that sort of research. So it really is an invaluable publication. So thank you very much, Howard. Thank you, Jim. I feel like there's so much more I could say, but I don't want to take up too much time. So I'll turn now to introduce our next speaker. And this is a recorded video that was sent to us by Robert Hewison. Many of you, all of you are familiar with Robert Hewison. He's a historian of contemporary British culture and an internationally recognized authority on Ruskin. He's held chairs at Oxford, Lancaster, and City universities. A former Slade Professor of Fine Art at Oxford, he is also an honorary professor at the Ruskin at Lancaster University, and he's currently chair of Ruskin Today.
Hello, Jim. I'm sorry I can't be there to take part directly in the celebrations of your 90th birthday. I shall be away in Ruskin's beloved Italy. I'll be near Assisi, where, as you will recall, Ruskin made that study of Cimabue's portrait of St. Francis in the lower church. Prompted by Helen Fillion, and gosh, that takes us back really to the beginning of modern Ruskin studies, you decided to include that image in that wonderful book you did, John Ruskin, A Life in Pictures. There it is. You'll notice that I'm standing against a wall of books by or about Ruskin. None of them would be here if it were not for you. I became interested in Ruskin in 1968 through that ephemeral medium, television, when I wrote a reconstruction of the Ruskin Whistler trial. Few people were interested in Ruskin in those days, but early in 1969, you assembled the cream of Ruskin scholarship at that time from America, Britain, France, Japan, and held a week-long conference at Brantwood. I had some hippie friends living nearby, and one of them memorialized my arrival at Brantwood by pony and trap in this little painting, A Visit to Mr. Ruskin. I did not wear a top hat. Brantwood that Easter was freezing cold, with ice on the inside of the bedroom windows. But the old man of Coniston was as beautiful as ever, the conversations were warm, and the conference became the beginning of modern Ruskin studies. I was converted. You introduced me to Rachel Trickett at that conference, and I decided to go back to Oxford to study under her. That meant the first of many fruitful visits to Benbridge on the Isle of Wight. And once, that is, you decided that I was serious, you were extremely helpful in my research. I'll never forget that afternoon when you and I together cracked the secret code that links Ruskin's Venetian notebooks to his Venetian worksheets. At the 1969 conference, we launched the Ruskin Association, whose tie I proudly wear. You were secretary, treasurer, editor, and heroic typist, producing these now fragile documents alongside the skillful printing that you taught at Benbridge School and the Ruskiniana, published by the Yellow Sands Press. By the last number of the Ruskin newsletter in 1989, that's 20 years later, the whole of Ruskin Studies had been completely transformed. Ahead lay the Ruskin Library, the revival of the Guild of St. George, Ruskin Today, and of course the Ruskin Centenary and Bicentenary. And throughout all that time, you remained as productive as ever, ploughing your bibliographic furrow. I don't think there's a single Ruskinian who has not had cause at one time or another to consult your work. But then you see, we are all, in a sense, your children. Ruskin said, "There is no wealth but life." And you, my good friend, have had a rich life. Happy birthday.
Sara?
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you to Robert for that. As he said, he can't be here because he's in Italy. But it was lovely to have that tribute to him, to Jim. And we're going to move now to a tribute from Dr. Stuart Eagles. Many of you know Stu and have also benefited from Stu's great generosity as a Ruskin scholar. Stu was educated at Lancaster and Oxford. He has written widely on Ruskin's legacies in Britain and across Europe, including Russia. He was secretary of both the UK's Ruskin Society and the Guild of St. George, and for many years he was the editor and designer of the Companion, the Journal of the Guild of St. George. He runs his own Ruskin blog, which I urge you to check out. That's stuarteagles.co.uk, and his next book is a study of John Ruskin Sheffield.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Jim. Well, first of all, I must thank the Ruskin Society of North America for organizing this event and for giving me the opportunity to wish Jim a very, very happy 90th birthday. Now, none of you can see me, but you'll have to imagine that I'm sat here with a glass of sherry in my hand, ready to make what is going to be an unabashedly personal tribute to Jim, who I am very fortunate to call my friend, as well as all the other things he is: teacher, author, lecturer, curator, collector, gentleman and scholar. I wondered where to begin, and I realized that that word "where" gave me the key. So I started thinking about places where we've met. And the first place we met was Lancaster University. It was that wonderful conference to mark the centenary of Ruskin's death. It was an uncommonly good summer, very sunny in the Lake District. We went on to Brantwood. One of the great treasures in my photograph albums is a shot that Jim Spates took of a group of us, which included Van Bird and you, Jim, and Jill, and several others, and I really do treasure that. We went up to the house afterwards and had a drink to celebrate Ruskin's work and legacy, and I'm sure that we had a glass of sherry. Next, I think of Oxford, and in particular Christchurch, Ruskin's alma mater, and it was there that I signed the role of the of companions of the Guild of St. George when you were master, Jim. And then a few years later, we were back at the library there where we celebrated the launch of your magnum opus, the Library of John Ruskin. We definitely had a glass of sherry to celebrate that. But in London, I particularly recall a meeting of the Ruskin Society, which it was the occasion at the Carlton Club, the Tory Carlton Club, where I didn't feel entirely comfortable, I must say. It was where Sir Richard Body gave his enjoyably idiosyncratic version of Ruskin. Before it started, I was stood under this enormous, imposing spiral staircase, I think with a glass of sherry in my hand. And you were with Jill, and you made the effort to come up to me to tell me how much you'd enjoyed something I'd written about Howard Whitehouse. I have to say that I really felt that I'd arrived. Those words of encouragement did more for me and my confidence than I can say, and it really did put me at my ease on that occasion too. Of course, I quickly learnt that this was entirely characteristic of your positivity and generosity to people, and I think it is a very special quality which is difficult to overestimate the importance of. It was a great honour to me a few years later when you invited me to celebrate with other Ruskinians your 80th birthday at the Civil Service Club, a very special occasion, and not least because you opened a bottle of Ruskin sherry, a very special bottle indeed, and a very special occasion to mark a very special man. When Clive Wilmer asked me to give the Ruskin lecture at York in 2010 on Ruskin and Tolstoy, I did feel very honoured, I must say, and all the more so when I found out who was giving the vote of thanks. You, of course, and you did it with your usual thoughtful grace, and your words of appreciation really rounded off what was a very special privilege for me. And I like to think that afterwards we stood there chatting about things with a glass of sherry in our hands, though actually I think that is a false memory or just wishful thinking on my part. Well, we've met in many places, of course, and we've been brought together by Ruskin and, well, yes, as I recall, probably sherry as well. I remember that somebody asked you once how you kept so sharp and active in your advancing years, and you said that it was partly thanks to a cheeky glass of sherry before bedtime. Well, it has to be said that must only be natural, given that Ruskin was the son of a sherry merchant, and you, Jim, are the author of Ruskin and the Demek, so who better qualified in all of this? I've learnt a great deal from you. You've given me so much inspiration and encouragement. Jim, thank you for all you've done for Ruskin, for all you've done for me, and yes, for the sherry too. Cheers.
Thank you, Stu. It's a delight to hear your voice. It's a delight to have that picture of you there. One of the things that I wanted to say is that I imagine we are all in the audience wishing we were around a couple of large tables having a glass of that wonderful Demek sherry. There can't be too many of those glasses left in the world, and at some point we should all get together and have one. Stu is a very dear friend, and also, as Sara said in her introductory comments, one of the more significant younger Ruskin scholars because of all the work he's done for Ruskin in various capacities. As editor of the Companion for a number of years, he was just terrific. Couldn't have been better. So thank you, Stu, for those lovely comments. I wanted to mention about Stu and thinking of Robert and the people who've spoken before. In all my experience of being an academic, of being a scholar over these many years of work, the thing that distinguishes the Ruskin people to me, as opposed to all the others, is their great hearts. Ruskin people have great hearts. They help you. They think well for you. They help you become what you can be and help you find what you cannot find in the course of your interactions with them. Stu Eagles is one of those people. And I now have the privilege of introducing another. I get to introduce Dinah Birch, whom almost everyone who is on this Zoom link knows. She is one of the major Ruskin scholars of the world, and she has graciously agreed to say a few words to Jim on this occasion of his getting the Lifetime Achievement Award. She is a world-renowned Ruskin scholar, as I mentioned a moment ago. She is Pro-Vice Chancellor for Cultural Engagement and Professor of English Literature at the University of Liverpool earlier. She was one of our wonderful speakers at the Ruskin Conference at the Huntington at the end of '99, which was the last time many of us were together. And so it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dinah Birch. Dinah, your comments on your life with Jim. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be able to contribute to this tribute to Jim Dearden on his 90th birthday. Happy birthday, Jim. We all owe you a great debt for all kinds of reasons. And I won't repeat what has already been said about all that Jim has done for Ruskin Studies. From my own personal perspective, I owe him a huge amount, and I won't be able to talk about it all. There is too much to say. So I'm going to focus on what is most important. And here I'll echo what many of our speakers today have singled out, that element of warm personal encouragement that characterizes Jim's presence, his omnipresence in Ruskin scholarship. It was in 1977 that I first visited Benbridge. I don't know whether you'll remember that, Jim, but it's a very, very clear memory for me. I was a newish doctoral student working on a thesis on Ruskin and the Greeks. Not only did I find a generous welcome at Benbridge, I also found a good deal of extremely necessary, tactful guidance, because like every beginner in Ruskin scholarship, I really did not know quite what I was doing. It is not easy to make a start as a Ruskin scholar. There is so much to read. There is so much to know. We need mentors and guides, and none has been greater than Jim in that respect. For generation after generation of would-be Ruskin scholars finding their feet, Jim has been preeminent among those guides. I was, in fact, already a member of the Ruskin Association that Robert Hewison's already mentioned, and that was an association run by Jim, and I was an eager reader of the Ruskin newsletter. And I do just want to pause for a moment to praise the achievement of Jim in producing for so many years the newsletter. It was a wonderful publication, edited, produced entirely by Jim. Here's my own, the very first copy that I ever had in spring 1976. I've been looking at it as a preparation for speaking to you. You won't be able to read the words, but it begins with an article hugely well-informed and witty about Ruskin on television. That is a long time ago. It is 45 years ago, but it has worn very well. And the point that I want to emphasize in looking at my own copies of the Ruskin newsletter and remembering what Jim has done for me, what Jim has done for us all, is simply how much he has taught us. Jim said in his video interview that he's a man for detail, and that's true, but that's not quite the whole story. What Jim represents and what Jim has communicated is such a substantial, huge body of information, facts, knowledge. It's more than detail. It's that complexity of the way in which we have come to understand Ruskin, grounded on real scholarship and knowledge, which Jim has communicated to us. And that is not to be underestimated for a moment. From that point of view, Jim has been a bedrock of our shared endeavor to reach a deeper understanding of Ruskin. Facts, information, detail, specificity, and above all, accuracy, getting things right before you build your interpretive model. And that matters so much. Jim, you have achieved an extraordinary amount as an individual scholar and as, how can I put this, as a human being, in that generosity after so many decades of no doubt very trying from time to time interaction with Ruskin scholars and students. I don't suppose we've always been easy to deal with, and your patience has never worn thin. I'm going to quote Howard Hull, who has said, Jim has single-handedly done more for the revival of interest in Ruskin than anyone else alive. I think that is absolutely true. And I think that what has been said today confirms it. We are all so grateful, Jim. Your achievement is extraordinary, and I, for one, will never forget what you have given to me. So here's to you and to this very richly deserved award that you receive today. Congratulations, and once more, happy birthday.
Thank you, Dinah. That was eloquently said, beautifully said, and the heart and soul of our message today, and our thanks to Dr. Dearden for all that he's given all of us. We are coming to an end of our program, folks. We have one more brief tribute, and then we will give the award to Jim and wrap things up. We are so grateful to all of you for coming and staying with us for this length of time. We have wonderful things already said, a few wonderful things yet to say. My next obligation is to introduce Clive Wilmer, known to us all who are on the Zoom today in various capacities. Clive is one of the great living Ruskinians as well. I cut my eye teeth on Ruskin with Wilmer. Many years ago, when I was getting interested in Ruskin, I read John Rosenberg's book on the genius of John Ruskin, and read the chapters on Unto This Last in particular with great interest, because I am a sociologist. And I realized that one of the essays of the 4 essays of Unto This Last was not in Rosenberg's book. And a year or two later, I got to go to England to teach students in England. And the first thing I did is I went to Waterston's bookstore in Earl's Court, and I looked for a book that had the 4th essay. And lo and behold, I found Clive's book, Unto This Last and Other Writings of John Ruskin. It became one of the Bibles of my life. I read it backwards and forwards and through and through and through. And just yesterday, because I'm working on a Ruskin book myself, I was conferring with the pages of it. Again, it is such a wonderful book. I recommend it to everyone. It should be on your shelves. It probably is already on your shelves. It is one of the great contributions. And then a number of years ago, a bit over a decade ago, after Jim's term as Master of the Guild of St. George, Clive was asked if he would become the Master of the Guild of St. George. Thankfully, he said yes. He spent a decade in the role. And I have to say, in anticipation of what Clive will say in honor of Jim, that he not only followed in Jim's footsteps, but he expanded the Ruskin world enormously. His vision of Ruskin being a worldwide treasure is very important. And he pushed that interest and emphasis all the time that he was Master of the Guild. We have much to thank Clive Wilmer for as well. He is a dear friend of Jim Dearden's as well. And now we have a moment to hear from him, his tribute to Jim Dearden. Thank you, Clive. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jim. I greatly appreciate the honor of being invited to speak on this lovely occasion. And I want to congratulate Jim on his 90th birthday and all his remarkable achievement. And I also want to say how proud I am to be speaking to the Ruskin Society of North America. So glad that it has come into existence and that it will always remain, I hope, a friend of the Guild of St. George. Anyone with a passion for John Ruskin will eventually want to own the library edition of his works. The strange thing is, though, that almost as soon as you take possession of those 39 fat volumes, you realize that 39 are not really enough, that there is more of Ruskin than is found in his publications. So then, doomed collector that you are, you seek out the various volumes of diaries and letters that have been edited and collected over the years. You seek out the various volumes of diaries and collections that have been edited and collected over the years, as well as various crucial publications that don't quite count as books by Ruskin. Among these, I would include the 4 books edited and introduced by Van Eyck in Bird, and most recently, Jim Dearden's bibliography of the books Ruskin owned, The Library of John Ruskin, published in 2012, which has been mentioned several times this afternoon. As an academic, I'm aware how valuable good bibliographies can be, but I can't say they normally get me very excited. This one, however, really does. For one thing, it has a superb introduction, perhaps the best thing Jim has ever written. But so fascinating is the content that the sooner if I look something up in it, I find I'm lost in the book, searching for this and that, and developing new concerns, as I should in a species of thriller. It's partly that the reconstruction of a long disbanded library demands, as somebody said already, the skills of a great detective, and partly that successful sleuthing recaptures a thorough knowledge of the subject's life and works. And that, of course, Jim has in spades. We've already heard from other speakers about the depth and extent of Jim's scholarship, his extraordinary filing cabinet of a memory, and his extreme generosity in making his knowledge available to others. It should be obvious that, as Peter Miller has said to me, these qualities and achievements inspire not just respect across the Ruskin world, but deep affection too. I share those feelings. But much as I might like to be, I don't think I'm much of a scholar myself. My concern has been more to interpret and appreciate Ruskin and make him generally more available to others, often with the aim of pointing to his modern relevance and setting him to work in the world we live in now. That is not an aspect of that is not an aspect of Ruskin that Jim has had a great deal to say about. I suspect that as a writer, he would dismiss it as rather too speculative. But it is nonetheless something he has worked for in a practical way. I'm of course thinking above all of Jim's role in the Guild of St. George. It's odd to reflect that when Jim initiated the Ruskin revival with the Brantwood Conference of 1969, he had not really given much thought to the modern guild, though he knew that it still existed and had had some minimal contact with it. Jim's Ruskin at that time lived in the study of his work, in Jim's care for the White House collection, in his own remarkable collection, and in his writing. Yet by setting up the conference, Jim had established himself as the leading figure among modern Ruskinians. And over the next decade, there began to be pressure to bring what were in effect the two wings of one movement into relationship. Before long, Jim was invited to become not only a companion of the Guild, but a director too, and he signed the role in 1969. This meant that Jim was to be directly involved in the Guild revival, which followed from the sale of the Verrocchio Madonna. For very good reasons, he was opposed to that sale. But I think he would now be the first to concede that it led to a huge upturn in the Guild's fortunes and the big projects that have come of it, all of which he was involved in some cases as the prime mover. The creation of the Ruskin Gallery in Sheffield, the Ruskin and Tuscany exhibition, the campaign for drawing, the triennial exhibitions, the revival of the Wire Forest, the Ruskin in Sheffield project. I know I've left some things out. John Isles, who's cared for our land in the Wire for the past decade, has reminded me that Jim, as master, was keen that the Guild should support a national movement to reverse the decline of wild flowers in Britain. At first, the Guild agreed to provide funding for 2 wildflower meadows in South Yorkshire, which are owned by the National Trust. But the directors quickly doubted that our gift was being used to much effect, and Jim made the crucial decision to divert the funding to our own land in Worcestershire, where the effect has been absolutely transformative. It also taught us the very Ruskinian truth that it is often best to make the most of what you already have, rather than seeking out new lands to conquer. Then what you have becomes exemplary. It's no secret that Jim became master unexpectedly at a time of severe crisis for the Guild. In 2004, a conflict on the board had erupted at the AGM, and the then master, Julian Spalding, resigned. There was a real danger that the Guild would fall apart. But Jim nursed it back quietly to health with his friendly, welcoming, and unsensational manner. Janet Barnes, Stuart Eagles, and Cedric Quayle, all past colleagues of Jim's and mine, have stressed, sorry, having a minor crisis here. Janet Barnes, Stuart Eagles, and Cedric Quayle, all past colleagues of Jim's and mine, have stressed this quality in Jim: the easy friendliness, encouragement, and conviviality that characterized his mastership. As his successor as Master of the Guild, I can only stress how grateful I am for the manner in which he in his time stepped down, the smooth transition he encouraged, and his helpfulness both on the board and off it once I had taken over. It was in fact Jim who proposed me as master. I especially appreciated this because, truth to tell, he and I had not always agreed about everything. He wanted the Guild to remain, and I quote his rambling reminiscences, quote, the same slightly small, eccentric organization which it had been when he joined it. And I was keen on expanding it and meeting what I thought of as the challenges of modernity. After 10 years as master, I can only say that though I haven't changed my opinion, I do now see more clearly the wisdom of Jim's. The Guild will achieve nothing by competing with other more modern organizations. It makes its mark by being its unique self. I just mentioned Jim's conviviality. It is often said of the board of directors that more important business tends to get done over the dinner table than during business meetings. There's a good deal of truth in this. Ruskin, of course, as Stuart has reminded us, was the son of a sherry merchant and cared about good wine. In the very last paragraph he wrote, he remembers how an artist depicting the marriage in Cana, quote, delighted himself in painting the crystal and ruby glittering of the changing rivulet of water out of the Greek vase glowing into wine. It is a moment of intense affirmation, and it stands for something the author of a recent Guild booklet on Ruskin and the sherry trade knows a good deal about. In this time of self-isolation and self-denial, we should be grateful that, courtesy of Zoom, you North Americans can come together from across your continent, and your friends from elsewhere across the globe can join you. But wouldn't it be nice, I imagine Jim thinking, if we could meet in person and clink glasses? Well, why don't we do the next best thing and wish Jim a very, very happy 90th birthday in a glass of wine. Please, everyone, raise your glasses to Jim Dearden, keeper of the Ruskin flame. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive. We are all in your debt for many reasons, as we'll all acknowledge gratefully. Jim, in particular, we are so glad that you have been with us today. So now Sara and I, as co-directors of the Ruskin Society of North America, want to thank everyone for being here. Thanks to all of our speakers, to Stuart, to Robert Hewison, to Rachel at the beginning of our time, to Clive just now, to Stu, to Dinah, and to Howard for doing the interview, which is invaluable and which you only saw a part of, folks. Do go to the Ruskin Art Club website and find the rest of that interview. It is an archival record of great importance in Ruskin studies. In any event, we thank everyone. Sara, your thanks. I have some more thanks to give, but you give some of yours.
You've already thanked some of the people I would have mentioned, but I want to thank all the speakers for making time to be here and for giving such warm and heartfelt and really deeply personal thanks to Jim. Thanks to Jim above all for everything that you've given to us, for being here today and for sharing your time with us, for sharing your knowledge and your generosity with us. Thank you to the Ruskin Society. Thank you to Katrina Lau, especially, who was responsible for all the technical detail on this event today. Without her, who knows what we would have done. So she did a wonderful job. Thank you for that, Katrina. And thank you also to the Guild of St. George. Thank you to Howard again for making the journey. And thank you to Ann Taylor and to the Ruskin Art Club of Los Angeles as well.
Yes, and I want to add very powerful thanks to Gabriel Meyer, who's a member of the board of the Ruskin Society of North America, who has been our stalwart companion and supporter in Ruskin studies these last 5 or 7 years. He is a wonderful colleague, friend, and has been with us even today in support of what we're trying to do. And to the Ruskin Art Club, the Ruskin Society of North America also needs to thank very clearly and profoundly the Guild of St. George, to Rachel in particular for her welcome when we established ourselves, to Simon Seligman at the Guild for all his support as we've gone on and as we planned for this particular event on this particular day. So thank you to all of these folks. Christina, again, thank you from me and all the members of the board of the Ruskin Society of North America. It has been a great event. And before we leave, I want to show you the plaque. We had a plaque created honoring Jim on this day. It says, I don't know whether you can make it out, but I think, Katrina, can you get that slide up so people can see it? If she can't, this is the plaque that we will be mailing to Jim that we had made locally. You see the roses in the top part of the plaque. It says to James S. Dearden, first recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Ruskin Society of North America, 14 August 2021. Jim, so many thanks. All the best. God bless you in your 10th decade as you continue on with your Ruskin work, as you continue on being a signal, an emblem for all of us as to how to live a wonderful and fruitful life in Ruskin. Where would we be without you? We hesitate to even imagine. Anyway, all the best wishes from us all to you across these 8 time zones.
Thank you all very much. Everyone take care and be well.
Be well.